Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on architecture and the Numinous, recovering the ground of self. Now, there are a number of ways I could have approached the presentation of this topic, because it's quite a vast topic. It's a very rich topic, but I wanted really to focus on a specific issue that I think is very crucial and key for understanding the architecture of the sacred and why we've lost it today. The key terms in this presentation are the word numinous and the word self. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. If we try to dissect and come to terms with terminology, the numinous is a very key term for understanding the sacred. It was a term that was coined by Rudolf Otto in the early 20th century in his study of religion. And I'm going to read here from a very good definition of what the numinous actually is. The numinous can be understood to be the non-rational experience of a mysterious terror and awe, majesty and beauty, in the presence of that which is entirely other, and thus incapable of being expressed directly through human language and other media. And the key here is the term non-rational, which I'll explain in a minute. But you may have noticed that the numinous covers the experience of a mixture of awe and majesty, beauty, in the presence of something that's so entirely other, so out of this world, so awesome, that the human being is incapable of expressing the experience in any language or medium. The numinosum or the numinous can be invoked by the awesomeness of nature, like a thunderbolt or a storm, or the beauty of a valley or a sunset, or by the awesomeness and majesty of architecture, as we can see here in this particular image of Gloucester Cathedral in England. So we have images of nature which evoke the numinous, which stop us in our tracks and make us wonder about the very nature of existence, and works of architecture also do the same thing. In fact, of all man-made objects or human-made objects, architecture is the grandest and most powerful in terms of rivaling the effect of the numinous in nature. As I said earlier, the numinous is a non-rational experience, and that's a very crucial term because we often divide, we can divide actually our experience in one way into three possible categories. The rational, which we are most familiar with, and especially today, we tend to reflect and talk about our experience in rational conceptual terms. And what characterizes the rational is that it is a reflective response to experience. It's not the experience itself, but rather the actual reflection on experience itself. There's also the irrational, which we often term or take to be the exact opposite of the rational. If the rational is based on good, sound reasons and makes perfect sense, the irrational then is the instinctive, the emotional response we have, or kind of experience that we may have. Now, the numinous, the experience of the numinous is neither rational nor irrational, but rather a third category altogether, a category that we seem to have abandoned altogether in our modern world, and that is the non-rational. And the non-rational is, like the rational and the irrational, a form of knowledge, a form of knowing the world, a way of engaging with the world, that is based on a vital, involuntary, total, and immediate experience. And so, for example, in the presence of the awesomeness of a mountain or a cathedral, we have a total, involuntary, immediate experience that overwhelms us in the very instant. And there's no reflection on the experience yet. It may be mediated through emotions and instinctual responses and visceral responses in our body, but it comes from somewhere much, much deeper and much, much more profound. And this third category of experience and knowledge is something that we need to really begin focusing on again. Because what happens often in our experience of aesthetics or art and architecture these days, or the numinous or nature, is that we either relegate it to an instinctual, emotional, wishy-washy feeling, or a secondary thought process of rationalizing the experience. But in both instances, we're not discussing the experience itself in its immediacy. And so recovering this non-rational source of experience and experience of the world and knowledge is very important, because non-rational experiences have a certain, give us a certain access to the world in ways that neither the irrational nor the rational can or do. And this is really encapsulated in the very famous quote by Socrates, where he says, "Wonder is the beginning of wisdom." And it's very, very true in many ways, because at the beginning of wisdom, and which is hikmah in Arabic, or philosophy, if you want, is the beginning, starts with wisdom, and that starts with wonder, because philosophy is the love of wisdom, and wisdom comes from wonder. But philosophy doesn't start with rational, abstract, conceptual thinking about the world, because that's a secondary thought process. It's a secondary stage upon which we reflect on our immediate experiences. But the very core, fundamental, intuitive, deep-seated wonder that we feel in the presence of the numinous is the very beginning of everything else that comes after, because everything else can be considered a way of rationalizing or coming to terms with this fundamental, awesome, out-of-this-world experience. That's very important to bear in mind, because in our modern world, of course, we have neglected this aspect of experience, and so we find ourselves caught between a duality. Either it's a rational, conceptual experience that makes sense, or it's irrational and therefore unreliable. But these categories are actually false dichotomies. If we were to borrow a wonderful quote from Rudolf Otto to really describe what the numinous is like, and of course, this interior dome of a Muslim mosque really reflects this kind of numinous experience, this whirlwind of a dizzying, a spiraling effect of the patterns as they move towards a single center. The feeling of it, i.e. the numinous, may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may pass over into a more set and lasting attitude of the soul, continuing, as it were, thrillingly vibrant and resonant, until at last it dies away and the soul resumes its profane, non-religious mood of everyday experience. It also may become the hushed trembling and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of the divine, or whom or what in the presence of that which is a mystery, inexpressible, and above all creatures. So now that we have a better understanding of what the numinous experience is, that is evoked both by nature and by human-made objects, like, for example, here, the very famous Hindu/Buddhist monastery, or sorry, temple in Angkor Wat, Cambodia, built around the 12th century. And you can see, really get a sense of being in the presence of the sacred and the numinous when one visits this site. And one often wonders why when one visits these ancient temples, one gets this remarkable feeling of being transported into another world, and yet we can't seem to replicate this experience in these kind of buildings in our contemporary world. Fundamental to the notion, the whole notion of the architecture of the numinous, is not just the physical architecture that you see before you, like the physical structure and plan of the temple that you see here, but something a little bit more profound. Architecture of the past, and when we talk about architecture of the numinous, we're not talking about architecture in terms of a physical building, rather we're talking about architecture in terms of the physicality and the spiritual, the invisible and the visible, the tangible and the intangible. Because the true architecture of a sacred building is not only that which is enshrined and concretized in the actual physical building itself, but that which is intangibly just beyond the veil of physical reality. The vastness of the macrocosm, however, is such that it was very difficult to conceive or internalize and understand as a totality. So the cosmos is so vast and so infinite because it is the manifestation, the infinite manifestation of an infinite divine being, that human beings require something more manageable to be able to engage with the complexity of existence. And so the vastness of the macrocosm is mirrored in the macrocosm. And works of art and works of architecture or sacred architecture really are nothing but a microcosm, a small mirror version of the vastness of the universe itself. And so when you look at works of sacred architecture like Angkor Wat, once again, one can see the relationship between the plan of the building and the actual physical, tangible architecture and the intangible mandala that it is supposed to be an expression of. One then begins to see that the real architecture of Angkor Wat is not the image below alone, but the image above and below together. So there are two sides of the picture that one has to constantly bear in mind. When one looks at something like this, for example, the Temple of Hatshepsut in Egypt, for example, and you see the processional pathway as it goes from the lower part of that image towards the upper part of that image, or if you can, it reaches something like this image here, which is a blind or false door that's often found in Egyptian tombs. So when you get to this particular door here on the left-hand side, it's actually a carving of a wall, a door in the wall. It's not actually a door. The reason being is because at the end of the temple, at the end of the tomb, the physical journey ends and the spiritual journey begins. And so the ba or the ka, the soul of the deceased, continues on the journey in the form of the soul itself beyond this physical barrier. So it's a door into the underworld. And this relationship between the physical and the non-physical, or the tangible and the intangible, or the visible and the invisible, is very crucial to understanding this transition and this relationship between the underworld in Egyptian architecture, for example, and temple architecture itself. Likewise, when one considers something like the Kaaba in Mecca, which is considered one of the largest mandalas in the world, where that is constantly animated by the perpetual movement of pilgrims, circumambulating it around 7 times, one doesn't really get a full idea of what the Kaaba is and what Muslims are doing really with their anti-clockwise circumambulation around the Kaaba, unless one really takes into account the invisible hierarchy of levels of being, which the Kaaba is only the last expression of. So in the hierarchy of existence, the physical Kaaba is considered the last manifestation in the physical world of what is considered the throne of God somewhere beyond the heavens. And of course, in traditional cosmology, the number of heavens was 7, and so the tawaf around the Kaaba is 7 because it requires 7 spiral movements upwards to reach to the archetype of the Kaaba, which is the throne of God. And likewise, one sees this relationship between the visible and the invisible in many places. In the upper left-hand corner is a virtual animation picture of the Temple of Luxor, for example, and you can see that processional movement from the pylon, the entrance gateway, all the way into the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. And Egyptian temples were often built along a certain kind of sacred geometry of the human body. So you can actually map the entire human body from head to toe on the Temple of Luxor, and many scholars have actually done the research on this subject. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, for example, in Hindu temples cut out of rock into the mountains, resembling the primordial womb from which all creation came forth. So the relationship here between the physical architecture and the intangible womb of creation is very palpable for the one who actually experienced it. Or in the lower right-hand corner, for example, the muqarnas that is often found at the entrance to mosques, or also in the transition between the main hall of the mosque and the actual dome itself. And we now know, for example, that in the 11th, 12th century, the muqarnas was developed as a structural artistic device at the same time that Muslim theologians and philosophers were discussing the very nature of and the fabric of reality and matter. And Muslim theologians came to the conclusion that though the world is underpinned by the physical laws of creation, what underpins the physical laws of creation is the arbitrary, well, not the arbitrary, but the will of God that holds the physical cosmos together. And so developed a theory of atomism, where things or creation or matter really consisted of atoms that are held together by a perpetual will of God that keeps them in place from instance to instance. And so when you look at the Muqarnas, you don't see the physical laws that hold up the structure, but rather you see beyond to the very molecular-like structure of the cosmos that's held together by some kind of magical will or divine will. And likewise, you get this sense of the sacred also in St. Peter's in Rome, which is a well-known structure. You get with Egyptian architecture, sorry, with the Greek architecture, the temple architecture, you get this wonderful relationship between the site itself and the type of deity. So for the Greeks, of course, the site of a temple was chosen very carefully in the landscape, because they believed, like in many ancient cultures, that specific places had a specific spiritual quality or a specific spirit. They call, later the Romans would call it a genius loci, a spirit of place. But for the Greeks, different places had a unique quality. And if you were to build a certain temple dedicated to a specific god, you had to choose the right kind of place that reflected the quality of this particular deity. So, sorry, an earth god, for example, or a god of the underworld, or a god of, who would often be located in a temple close to the earth or in a valley. The sun god would often be located usually on top of a hill, etc., etc. And the temple was then built in such a way to house the very presence of the god. Unlike churches and mosques, which are usually places of gathering for people to come together and worship inside the structure, Greek temples were not places where people came to worship inside, but rather they often visited the temple because of the divine presence, or the presence of a specific deity in the building. And usually the altar was placed on the outside of the building rather than the inside. Sorry. So we can go on and on and on really about the sacred nature of various architectural traditions before the modern world. In the lower right-hand corner, for example, you have a wonderful Zen garden, and you can see also the relationship between the location and the placement of the stones in the upper right-hand corner and the sacred cosmology. So, for example, Stonehenge was designed and built to overlap and correspond to a certain cosmic constellation of the stars, and to establish a certain relationship between heaven and earth itself. Thank you very much. I had a bit of a cold. And what's so remarkable about all the people who built these structures, whether it's the lower left-hand Mayan temple, or the mosque, or Stonehenge, or the church, is that they all had a specific understanding of the relationship between the world and self. They subscribed to a variety of different kind of cosmologies. So, for example, here you have an image of a possible image of cosmology. Of course, cosmology is a science of cosmos, creation, the universe, as it were, and the relationship between different parts of the universe. And so here you have a variety of different levels of heaven, and you have earth, and you have the underworld. Most cosmologies usually have this relationship between heaven, earth, and an underworld or subterranean world. But what's so interesting is that the ancients lived in a different world called self-matrix. I call this self-world matrix, or the world self-matrix. This nexus, this relationship between world and self, is fundamentally different in the ancient world than it is in our modern world. Here's another image also of a different kind of cosmology that's more familiar in the tradition of Dante and medieval Christianity, where you have the 7 levels of heaven, and the upper empyrean, paradise, and then you have purgatory at the center of the earth. the point of showing you all these cosmologies is really to show that the relationship between the world and self, it was one such that the self is as extensive as the world in which it comes to light. And I'm going to explain this in a minute. This is a very crucial point. But the self in ancient thought extended beyond one's physical being to cover the entire cosmos. And once we lose a certain kind of cosmology, entire cosmic understanding of symbols and creation, the self becomes reduced to something infinitely smaller than it actually is. I'm going to give you an example also of a building that was saturated or drowned in a certain cosmology. Rosslyn Chapel, for example, is a very famous chapel in Scotland, built in 1446. It's, of course, a Christian chapel, a house of worship, and you can see the Virgin Mary there at the entrance. It's a wonderful wonderful Gothic chapel designed in the Gothic late Middle Ages as an image of a much more ancient structure, which is the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, but also an image of the heavenly city above, or and so when you look at the various plans and aspects of the actual structure itself, you can see, as many scholars have demonstrated, and it's not something we're going to get into right now, but just to give you an idea, it's a structure that reveals a variety of different kinds of symbolic relationships at the level of the plan itself, at the level of the building, the plan, relationship of columns to one another, relationship of bays to one another, relationship of different parts of the vault to one another. If you look up at the vault, and you can see a variety of different kind of ornamental motifs, you can also see a variety of different kinds of creatures, creatures that one can't really explain purely from a Christian perspective. But what Rosslyn shows is a particular cosmology that had found its way into late Middle Ages Scotland that combines a lot of Neoplatonic symbolism with Hermetic tradition and Christian mystery symbols, all crammed into one building, reflecting a very interesting Renaissance cosmological view of the world, especially in the tradition of Neoplatonism, of Marsilio Ficino, and particularly Giordano Bruno and others, in which pagan symbols, symbols from late antiquity, sat side by side with Christian symbols and often even Islamic symbols. And you see these, for example, this image of the green man with foliage emerging out of the mouth, and a variety of other also fantastic beasts and creatures that derived from a very, very vivid imagination. Symbols that have become absolutely central for many spiritual esoteric traditions. But the point of showing you all these slides of Rosslyn Chapel, and this is the apprentice pillar, very famous pillar inside the chapel. The point of showing you is that the medieval pilgrim who went to, or the medieval pilgrim for whom the chapel was actually designed, would have been very familiar with an entire cosmology that ranged from the physical world all the way up to the highest reaches of the heavenly abode. And without this extensive cosmology, none of this architecture makes any sense. And the journey of the self through the various levels of being, which are all encapsulated in this microcosmic image, which is the chapel itself, would not make any sense. Today, as tourists, when we visit the building, we can't really make much sense of it, because we've lost this cosmology of the Middle Ages. And even though we may read about it and often learn and agree or even adopt some of its ideas, the totality of this cosmological framework is lost to us. Which is why when we walk into the building, we find it very hard to be able to experience what the intended experience may have been. So you exist here in layers and layers of symbolic meanings that are supposed to transpose the self on a trajectory from the physical to the spiritual. If we come back to this notion of world and self, partly to explain what went wrong in the past 200-300 years, why we don't have a cosmology. That's another issue, really, why we don't have a cosmology anymore. It has to do with the Enlightenment and the turn towards reason as the absolute arbiter of truth and the abandonment of the old ways. But what this meant was that the pre-modern self was considered an extensive self, whereas the modern self is often referred to as an intensive self. And this is something I borrow from the medieval historian Edward Kranz, who, having studied medieval texts and medieval cosmology, came to the realization that the modern self is fundamentally different from the pre-modern self, especially the self in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, the self was extensive, and the modern self is intensive. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if we go on to this next slide, the pre-modern self was an extensive self. What I mean by that is, if you look at the circle in the middle, you'll see that there's a green circle with self in the middle. And this is a self, or each one of ourselves that comes into this world. And the self was often considered part of the world, not something that's separate from the world. And over the years, as someone matured and grew, and as their knowledge of the various aspects of reality increased, the self itself grew and grew to encompass the entire world of that cosmology. So, for example, if I come into this world here with a basic sense of my own identity, my ego identity, and then gradually myself, I managed to recognize myself, and then somehow grow through the practice of virtue and through the acquisition of certain forms of knowledge. And in a world in which the entire cosmos is considered a theophany, a cascade of manifestations of the divine that reveal certain symbols that carry me forth on their wings to a higher level of existence, the self grows and grows and extends. The self grows and extends and extends and extends until it is able to contain the entire macrocosm within itself. And that's a very, very interesting understanding of the relationship between self and world, because here the self grows like a tree, as it were. The self grows from a center, and because of the extensive relationship or the continuity between the physical and the spiritual, it grows out of this fundamental ego identity, which every human being is born with, to encompass the entire levels of existence of the whole cosmos itself. Whereas in our modern age today, modern self is an intensive self. And by that, Kranz means, and this is my own take on the issue, is that something happened about 250 years ago, where we no longer saw this fundamental organic symbiotic relationship between self and a sacred cosmos anymore, but rather we began to see the self as something that is detached from the world. And the fundamental philosophical problems that developed since the Enlightenment were, how is the self related to the world? How do we know things in the world? And by separating ourselves from the world and no longer considering the world sacred at all, what happens is, when the world ceases to be that sacred entity to which we draw ourselves out towards it, what happens is the self, or particularly the ego, grows and becomes overinflated and includes within itself too many things that are supposed to be located out there in the world. And so, for example, instead of humbly construing our relationship to the cosmos as a part of a whole, the self now arrogates to itself, or it gives itself now this self-autonomy that doesn't intrinsically belong to itself. And by denying the capacity of other modes of knowledge to give us knowledge of the world, and by reducing our understanding of the world to just reason, which is located somehow within me, whereas intuition and other forms of knowledge are not reducible to my own being, but rather is located within a wider society and a wider nexus of things, the ego becomes inflated, and the self, well, the ego mainly, not really the self, becomes inflated vis-a-vis a world that increasingly shrinks away because it's no longer sacred. It's no longer a set of symbols at all, but just a physical world at the disposal of this ego, this overinflated ego. And what happens is you get this situation, this very troubling situation where, and this is, you know, each one of us on the left, like myself, scratching our heads, standing on this side of a chasm, of a big gulf. On this side is the subjective inner world, on the other side is this objective outer world. And this is the self here, or this is us, and that's the world there. Somehow we're separated from it, whereas earlier we were part of it. And we may have certain kinds of feelings and emotions and moods and sensibilities, but we also have reason, concepts, ideas, understanding. And this is what the philosophers tell us in the 18th century, whereas reason, concept, and ideas, understanding gives us access to an objective truth. Unfortunately for them, feeling, emotion, mood, sensibility, intuition gives us access to a subjective experience. And of course, subjective experience is bad because it's not a reliable source of knowledge of the world. And the only way we can actually approach the objectivity of the world is through the objectivity of scientific, rational reason. And this is the fundamental problem that's happened in the past 250 years. It's created this wedge, this huge wedge that's quite unbridgeable unless we recover other modes of knowing and jettison or put aside this false dichotomy between inner and outer, subjective and objective. Rather, what we need to do is recover this world self matrix in which the self is an integral part of the world. And the world here, I don't mean just the physical world, but the entire cosmic hierarchies from the divine being all the way down to the physical realm and all the intermediate realms in between. And here we have to recover a more integral or holistic understanding of the self. Because in our common understanding today, when we talk about the self, we usually say, for example, that I come into this world and I exist on a horizontal axis that stretches from birth to old age. So from birth, I might go through childhood, adolescence, a young adult, become a middle-aged adult, and then a mature old person. And along the way, somehow I evolve, I develop over time. So this horizontal axis is really a one that stretches from birth to old age. But it's basically the same, my same being, my same self really evolving over time. And if we look at it collectively, we can say that also the horizontal axis reflects the development of human beings from early history to the present moment in time. But what this perspective, and today we often only speak of the horizontal axis really, but what we're missing is really the importance of the vertical axis. And the vertical axis is absolutely important because it reflects a different dimension of our being entirely. The vertical axis tells us that not only do we develop from birth to old age or from early human history to present human history, but we also evolve upwardly along an ontological path from the lower level of being to a higher level of being, in which there is an existential intensification of my degree of existence or being or light. And so I may evolve over time, acquiring a wide range of skills, developing my ego, developing my rational side of the brain, my feeling function, my intuitive function, all these aspects or these four thinking types, if you will, in the Jungian, typical Jungian psychological framework of development are along a horizontal axis. But there's also a vertical mode of development in which I attain certain levels, higher levels of consciousness and understanding. And the higher I rise in this vertical axis, or the more I evolve vertically along this vertical axis, the more I intensify my degree of light, my degree and my share in existence. In the ancient world, they used to describe it as becoming more light. Of course, in the ancient cosmologies, the human being consists of light, and all beings, all creatures in the universe are a mixture of light and darkness. But the human being is the only creature that is able to intensify the degree of light and become more and more and more luminous until at the very peak of this vertical axis, they achieve oneness with the light of lights, which is the divine. And so we really have to bear in mind, keep in mind this horizontal and vertical axis. And I see this integral or total self as not just a two-dimensional vertical and horizontal axis, but more a three-dimensional sphere or a bubble, as it were. If the horizontal axis works along time, the vertical axis works in a spatial sense. What do I mean by that? Because this is very crucial for understanding the importance of how we can recover another mode of being. People often tell us in the modern world, and this is one of the fundamental accusations, you can't turn back the clock, the hands of time, you can't turn the clock back, we can't recover something which is lost. And this is a very pernicious criticism, because it seems to suggest that the kind of knowledge and truth that we are trying to recover is lodged somehow, somewhere in some distant past, and that we're trying to bring the past back to the present. But rather, it's not the case at all. What one is recovering is the eternal truth that people in the past once had access to, recovering that truth and access to it today, right here, right now. Because the eternal is not bound by the strictures of time. The eternal is never changing. It is eternal, it is durable, and so access to it is something that can happen at any point along this axis. It just requires a choice and a will to turn one's attention in that direction. And so when one says, okay, you can't turn back the hands of time, one's response is, we're not trying to recover a lost past, but what we're trying to recover is the eternal truth that is here and now and is always present in the present moment. And so if we look at this axis once again, at any point in time, this vertical axis penetrates up into the eternal permanent realm, the realm of permanent things and eternal truths. At any point along this axis in time, one has access to it. So one doesn't have to imagine a line or an arc going back in time, but rather a vertical line going up beyond the false constraints of time into the eternal present within which the divine forever dwells. Because of course, the divine exists beyond time and space. It's not constrained. And so the divine is ever present to each one of us now, as it was, and ever was in the past, and will ever be in the future. Past, present, future are our categories for understanding the unfolding of existence. But the divine, of course, is beyond that. And so an existential decision right here and right now, not to look behind me towards something that has gone by, but to look up towards something that is ever present. And that's what the vertical axis always emphasizes. So when we call for a recovery of the kind of experience that the ancients had, we're not trying to recover their experience. We're trying to allow ourselves to have an experience of our own here and now of the divine. And that's very, very important to keep in mind. Okay. And so the question then presents itself, how do we recover? And this is the question I often get in many of my talks. How does one recover the kind of sacred architecture and the Numinous today? And this particular slide partly explains that. But without a full recovery of an entire cosmology, it's very difficult to imagine how the Numinous can be recovered in sacred architecture today. Wherever you look today, for example, people are designing mosques and churches and temples everywhere. And one rarely gets the feeling that the kind of architecture, the design is really numinous. There seems to be a fundamental quality lacking in contemporary sacred architecture that the ancients seem to possess, we seem to lack. And in our inability to understand the significance and meaning of symbolism anymore and cosmology, we seem to be producing spaces that have no multi-layers of meaning or significance or symbolism whatsoever. And I have a few examples here of a few buildings that are quite interesting examples of the attempt to recover the sacred in our modern world. But for example, this is the Brother Klaus chapel in Switzerland, designed by Peter Zumthor. And from the outside, it seems like a very basic cubic structure. But when one enters into the inside, one gets a feeling. Sorry, these are the slides that are supposed to be there. A feeling of being in a very serene place, very spiritual place. But then there are other examples like these ones here, where these are two churches. One gets the feeling that somehow the sacred is absent, which is not to say that these are not houses of worship or not houses in which people can commune with God, but the palpable absence of a certain kind of architecture leaves one feeling that something has been fundamentally and crucially lost. I'm going to stop it there and go to Q&A so that we can wrap up within the hour. If there are any questions, please do let me know. There is one quick idea that I wanted to touch on quite briefly now that we're waiting for the first question, which is a question I often get asked on a regular basis, which is, what's the fundamental relationship between proportions and sacred architecture? Why do most sacred buildings in the past seem to have a specific kind of proportion or proportional system? And it's a very important point to emphasize, because modern architectural schools have abandoned this idea of proportion altogether, claiming that it's irrelevant for doing architecture today. But the ancients understood that nature is designed or created or manifests according to a certain proportional relationship of parts to whole. The Greeks chose to write this or express it through a proportion of numbers and proportion of parts to whole. And so the idea was, if the natural world, which is perfect, the perfect expression of the divine, is the kind of that instills a certain sacredness and stillness and peace within us when we walk through nature, when we observe nature, then the best way to really design our buildings, our sacred buildings in particular, is by deriving proportions derived from nature. Human beings can't really outdo nature. We can't really outdo the beauty of the natural world. All we can really do is mimic or emulate nature itself. And so the proportional relationships that you find in nature are then transposed into the proportional relationship of part to whole in buildings. And the idea here is that in the same way in which nature instills a certain harmony within us, if these harmonic proportions are found in buildings, then they will instill the same sense of harmony and balance within us. And so when we enter into a Greek temple, the idea was the Greek temple's harmonic proportions would act on the person experiencing the building by reconfiguring one's very being in a harmonically proportioned manner. And so architecture here acts like a mirror of the highest possible ideals. In the ancient world, architecture, especially sacred buildings, concretized and represented the highest possible ideals to which the human being aspired to, and reflected it back towards them, such that it would reconfigure the very experience of space itself. Today, in many of our buildings, we tend to, our architecture, or our, even our sacred architecture tends to reflect the chaos of our world around us. But the sacred architecture is not supposed to reflect, like a mirror, the chaos around us, but rather it's a mirror that's supposed to be turned upwards to reflect the higher ideals of a celestial realm, so that by constantly engaging and experiencing these buildings, we actualize further along the path of self-development. We actualize these higher ideals within us.
Okay, we have online questions.
Yes.
Can we experience the vertical axis from birth?
We're born. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question 100%, but we definitely are born with a horizontal and vertical axis. And from birth, our journey from birth to old age is really a journey of actualizing the possibilities of our horizontal development, which I think psychology of Carl Jung does extremely well with the four quadrants, you know, our intuitions, our reasoning faculty, our feeling faculty, etc., etc., and overcoming our shadow, integrating our anima and animus, etc., and then also our vertical dimension towards actualizing higher degrees of being and reality, which you usually find in mystical traditions and writings on the practice of virtue, meditation, prayer, etc. So yes, we do have the vertical dimension. It's interesting that the questioner mentions birth, because it's often said in many traditions that when we're born, we're born crying because we've just departed from the celestial world, and we weep over our departure. And so there's a certain innocence at birth that we possess, but also a certain primordial link to the divine that is already there. But it's not the highest form of actualization. Actually, the highest form happens over an entire lifetime, and for many people, they never get the chance to even develop their vertical dimension whatsoever, and exists purely on a horizontal dimension. Ours was the first civilization that has completely obliterated the vertical dimension and exists only purely on a horizontal one. In the past, all civilizations, all pre-modern civilizations, all traditional civilizations had both a horizontal and a vertical dimension, but it was individuals who chose not to develop themselves on a vertical axis. And maybe today, we lack the vertical dimension at a civilizational scale, which is what's so terrifying, and why we've lost this capacity to understand the architecture of the past and even to do that kind of architecture today.
Okay, we have another question. What can be done to recreate that link between architecture and nature and our modern world?
Oh, this is a very, very interesting question indeed. I think personally, this is my personal conviction, re-establishing a link between self and world, or self and the natural world around us, but of course world means much more than just the natural world, requires that we transform our own relationship to our own self, recovering the depths of our own interior experience by turning inwards along a path of internal spiritual development will open up our eyes to the world again as not just a physical world, but also a world of theophany, a world of symbols, a world of manifestations of something that can transport us. You know, the ancients saw the world as a series of hoists and ladders, not literally, but in the sense of everything was a symbol that led to something higher and to higher and to higher. Everyone was on a perpetual ascent somehow. Everyone was on a certain stage of that upward journey. So turning inwards, and the symbol or the motto here of know thyself, the motto of core is the crucial key towards doing that, because we're centuries, possibly decades away from a collective recovery of the world as something sacred. We're years away from that, but at a personal level, that can be achieved within a lifetime.
Another question.
Yes.
Do you think that modern architecture took part in forming our population today?
Took part in forming?
Our population today.
Forming our population? Yeah,
forming our population today.
I think,
or is it the opposite way around?
I think modern architecture has had a catastrophic effect on people, because, you know, the ancients understood something, and they understood it quite well, the power of architecture to mold people. And that's why they saw, especially sacred architecture, as the kind of architecture that, and not even just sacred architecture, but even the architecture of civic buildings. If you go look at a city like Rome, for example, both its temples and its civic buildings reflect a certain classical proportional understanding of architecture. It represents or manifests or expresses the highest ideals of classical humanism, whether it's through its statuary, its statues, symbols, its art, all of the art, all of the mythology you find and symbols in there, all of the temples, even the proportional classical language used in architecture, is all meant to reflect back to the average Roman citizen the highest ideals to which they aspire towards. So architecture in that sense was a means of ennobling the human being, making them better. Around the 20th century, when modern architecture or modern architects decided to break with the past, with 10,000 years of human history and wisdom, and say, all of a sudden, tabula rasa, let's start from scratch. By turning their back on the wisdom of the past, they turn their back on an infinitely rich tradition of how to do architecture. But also, it fell into the trap of reducing architecture to that first category we saw, which is rational abstract kind of architecture that doesn't really, hasn't in the 20th century proven to be able to really make us better human beings. Which is why modern architecture, for all intents and purposes, seems to have failed. We're in a postmodern age right now, which seems even worse. And which is why we tend to seek out old London, Rome, Siena, San Gimignano. We go to Athens, we go to old Istanbul. We go to all these older places because we seem to encounter a richer urban architectural experience that somehow is saturated with multiple levels and layers of meaning that afford the self or give the self a richer existential experience. Modern architecture affords the self very little experience, unfortunately. Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming, and hopefully I'll see you again at the next lecture.